Hey everybody, Dr. G here with our first module mini review and questions gleaned from the note-taking assignment. So my goal is really to answer your questions. I want you to think about questions. I want you to generate questions. So what are those questions for? For me to answer them, right? So I gleaned questions from, I gleaned a bunch of questions as best I could from this first set of notes. Here's some appended ones. There was way more. There was detailed ones, but these are ones that I could answer pretty directly right now, and we're going to tighten this up. The next set of notes, I'm going to have you submit the questions through a Google form, and then I can go through them more cleanly and really try to tighten this up to where these types of videos in these fourth week labs, and for you to watch later, because I'll post this, are for you to kind of go back and reflect on some of the big ideas that other people had questions on, or hopefully those questions were shared by you. So here's just a couple things that we're going to talk about here for the next 10 minutes or so, or I'm going to talk to you about. At what rates do things happen in biogeochemistry? Right? We're going to talk about rates in biogeochemistry. A little bit more about the spheres, right? We'll cover that for a second. Do different soils store different amounts of carbon? Right? That's an interesting concept, and I'll give you a little bit of why. A little bit about residence time, a little bit more about scale, at least bring up that concept again. Mass balance as a concept, flux as a concept. They're really important to all things we're talking about. And then, how is carbon tracked in an ecosystem? How is it dated? And what about Mauna Loa? How do we measure that? And then the last one is, why do soils have horizons have letters? And that's a nice one because that leads us in to what we're going to be talking about in the coming weeks. So, number one question was, what about rates in biogeochemistry? Right? Well, here let's just quickly review the idea of soils as systems and all the different types of systems that are both internally and externally interacting with soils, right? So remember, our kind of hit list was soils have volume, there's solid liquids and gases, those three phases at all times. There's secondary structure, aggregation, and development of soils over time. There's physical properties like texture. There's color, that's representation of the mineral matrix, organic matter, and other processes. There are voids or pores, things where gas and water can be held or moved, and we're finding out more and more that that's where a lot of the action is in soils. And then the general question that I ask you, does soil support life, or is it alive? Okay, so the spheres, that was a question next. So what are the spheres, right? The atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the geosphere, and the biosphere. Soils play this really unique role on our planet that they bring those different spheres or systems together. They integrate the atmosphere by gas exchange both into plants that are supported by soil and gas exchange back out of soil, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and others. They integrate the hydrosphere, right? Water comes from the pools, the ocean. It evaporates and comes onto land. It either infiltrates into soil and gets into the soil system for plant roots to uptake, or for it to percolate into groundwater systems, or it runs off into surface water. But all that water is mediated through soil, right? Evaporation from soil surfaces provides water to the atmosphere that can condense again and come down as fog, form fog, or come down as rain, and so on. So it's really critical in mediating the water cycle. The geosphere, soils, weather, rock. Plants provide energy to soil and to the soil system to promote weathering and decomposition. And those processes liberate nutrients from those rocks, from the geosphere, to provide those elements for plant growth and for other processes in ecosystems. Soils, weather, rock, they break things down. And then obviously, clearly the biosphere. Soils support plant life, they support microbial life, and all the interactions that happen because of soil. Okay, so I can't leave this slide without talking about the four basic processes. This is the foundational idea of a mass balance model, that soils can be viewed as what are being added to them, what's being lost from them, what is being moved around in the soil, and what form is it in, what's being transformed. And you could talk about that with any aspect of soil. What's being added to it, what's being lost from it, where are things and where are they moving around and why, and Why are things being changed from one form to another? And these four basic processes mirror these spheres very nicely because water is added, gases are added or removed, things are moved because of gravity, water and gases, and things are transformed because of the energy and the processes that happen in soil. So I want to get on to talking about residence time, carbon storage, those types of ideas. So we talked about shortly in one of the last videos about the two carbon cycles, the short and long term. So we talk about rates. Things can happen in soils from instantaneously through very long periods of time. The decomposition or the respiration of CO2 from soil could happen at the instantaneous through days scale. The weathering of a rock might take decades, century, millennia, depending on the location. So these rates are anywhere from right now through tens, hundreds, thousands, millions of years, depending on what you're talking about. So a mass balance is literally just a budget. It's a way for us to say, at this point in time, this much of whatever's in there. And then you could start to think about rates and fluxes. How did it get there? Why is it in that form? How long is it going to be there? That's that idea of residence time, and I'll come back to that in a second. These big ideas that you need to think about. Pools, what's there, how much? Fluxes, how much is moved from this spot to this spot over time? Turnover, how quickly does something go from the form it's in to a different form? Residence time is the inverse. How long is it staying? How long is it there? And then gradient. Gradient is just the difference between two states of matter. You could think of a gradient most obviously as a slope in a landscape. So a very shallow slope versus a very steep slope. And the gradient of energy or the potential energy in those two slopes is very different. This is also chemical compositions and positions. Plants are constantly manipulating the soil environment to create gradients. As a plant uptakes a nutrient, it becomes less in quantity versus some other place in the soil. And thermodynamics and equilibrium say that equilibrium needs to be achieved. So things start moving towards the lower state or the lower concentration of that element or matter. Okay, we'll talk about this again and again and again. How about this one question I asked about how big is a petagram? A petagram is a gigaton or a billion tons or 10 to the 15th grams, which I've put here. That's a lot. A gigaton is a lot. And we use those quantities, these are all in gigatons, because that's what we're talking about at a global scale. Vegetation holds about 650 gigatons of carbon on and off again throughout the year. Gross production every year, about 120 gigatons, about 60 gigatons of autotrophic respiration and fires. So carbon lost by plants for their metabolism. Another 55-ish is lost via heterotrophic respiration or decomposition. And then there's some other fluxes in and out of the atmosphere to the ocean. And then our fossil fuel, our year in and year out fluxes related to fossil fuel use. So another question was, are all soils equally capable of storing carbon and having different properties? Of course. We talked about the CLORPT, right? The climate, organisms, parent material, relief, and time, which is this basic fundamental model for us to think about how soils got to the form they're in right now. And each one of these factors has some indication about that question about carbon storage or soil properties. Climate is strongly influential on soil properties, productivity, weathering, and otherwise. The organisms that are there have that same role. The parent material varies greatly on what it can do. How quickly will it weather? Will it form minerals that are more sorptive and more capable of storing things? Topography. Flat land is very different than sloping land. And soils that are disturbed because of erosion don't form as quickly and sometimes cannot store as much carbon as those more developed soils. And then obviously time. Time is the wild card in all these things. How long is something sitting there? How long is a force acting on that soil to produce something? So to answer that question, soil carbon is different across the landscape based on land management, human activities, and intrinsically based on ecosystem properties. That's kind of cool, right? So here we've talked about this book, this model, and here we can see a variety of different soils in boxes, not in place, but you can see the variation in them. And then we can start thinking about, why does that matter? Well, we have a finite resource base. We live on planet Earth. There's only so much planet Earth, and we really need to consider, you know, appropriate management, understanding the resource by being able to model it and understanding where it is in place. This model of CLORPT allows us to start thinking about ways to model and approximate soil properties across the landscape through numerical means. And then we can go out and validate that through physical means. Okay, so residence time. I'm just going to hit this up really quickly again because it's a good place to have a question. Here's another example of the carbon cycle. Here is, pardon me, carbon dioxide budget for 2007 through 2016, and you can see that and these are in petagrams or gigatons as well. Across that 9-year period, about 34.3 gigatons were released from fossil fuel burning. A growth of about 17 gigatons in the atmosphere. The land has been able to absorb quite a bit of that along with the ocean. But my question is of this land sink or this ocean sink, if carbon's being stored on land in vegetation and soils, or in the ocean as carbonate, bicarbonate, or as a solid, as calcium carbonate or something like that, how long will it stay? That's the residence time. If a tree fixes carbon in its biomass and that tree lives for 1,000 years, the carbon in that biomass residence time of 1,000 years. If a grassland fixes carbon in the spring and it dries out, and then a fire comes through and burns that grassland up, the residence time is less than 1 year. It's just the amount of time that it's staying in that form. All right, quickly want to pivot back to scale just for a second, right? Scale has two main dimensions that we care about, space and time, right? Spatial scale, the size of Chico, the size of California, the United States, the scale of a watershed or a field, right? What spatial scale are you talking about? And then obviously the temporal scale is very important. Are we talking about something that happens over a year or over 100 years? And that's back to your carbon turnover question. How quick or slowly are things happening? These dimensions are really important for us as humans to start to understand what are the implications of our actions and at what scale is appropriate for us to implement practices, either farming or mitigation, restoration, right? Won't go into too much about the ecosystem properties, but just know that ecosystems have energy coming into them because of the sun and because of plants' ability to capture the sun's energy. Energy is constantly being pumped into ecosystems, and that's allowing those ecosystems to develop and provide a variety of different services to us as humans, along with wildlife and others. One that stuck out in my head, a little bonus question, this idea of porous boundaries. Someone brought that question up in their notes, like they wanted to know more about porous boundaries. It's just that it's not fixed. Your water bottle that you carry to class that has a lid has a solid boundary. The boundary between the water inside the water bottle and the external is rigid. It is solid. There isn't a lot of exchange until you take the lid off and you drink it or you spill it. Ecosystems aren't that way. They have complete exchange with surrounding elements of other ecosystems or other parts of the planetary system. Gas exchange, dust, birds picking up things and taking them to another spot. There is no wall, there is no barrier. Porous boundaries just mean that they're all interconnected. And as I said in the previous video, everything inside of the atmosphere on our planet is connected, depending on the time scale that you're viewing it. Rocks that are down at the bottom of the ocean someday will be up and be part of a mountain range. Not in a human time scale, but on a geologic time scale. Other things happen much more quickly. The poor management of the Central Plains during the the teens of the last century led to the Dust Bowl, which created a massive flux of dust, particles, and sediment from that region to other parts of the world. Or even just recently, the fires that have been happening around Northern California have been providing dust and bad air quality across the continental U.S., obviously depositing ash and other particles in different ecosystems along the way, across Nevada, across the Rocky Mountains, throughout the Midwest, all the way into Vermont, New Hampshire, the Atlantic Ocean, and otherwise. Okay, last couple slides and we'll be done for this. So I just want to reiterate, people want to know what a flux is, right? A flux is just the movement of something across a defined area over a defined amount of time. Here, this figure shows you just a conceptual diagram of some area, A, and the flux is literally the movement of energy or matter, depending on what you're trying to understand, across that area over a set amount of time. So it's just a rate, right? And here I put it in another term. You could probably imagine. Try your garden hose to some level, pour the garden hose into a bucket for a certain amount of time, and you'll be able to measure the flux. The area that the water is coming out of the hose is fixed. The amount of time that you measure it is that amount, and the quantity that you end up with will tell you the flux. It's just a rate. How much per area per time. Now, we talk about fluxes. It's really important because we're talking about soil development, loss, addition, those types of ideas. Flux can occur over very discrete, very small spatial areas. It can occur over large. Fluxes can occur over short periods of time or very long periods of time. It's just our ability to measure that property and understand it, and as a way for us to quantify, to measure aspects of ecosystems. I'm going to return to scale just for a second. Similar updated figure from this. It's a really great way to think about scale. Small things rule the world. Root hairs, the interactions of plants with microbes and roots and soil really drive global processes. Now, it's hard to believe that something that you cannot see or is so small you need to see it with the microscope is actually driving global biogeochemical processes outside of the energy of the sun. That's there. That's really pushing everything forward. But these tiny things have massive implications when you add them up. There's so many of them. They're causing such a big factor. So somebody asked me about how do they measure carbon at the Mauna Loa plot. They literally just go out and capture the atmosphere and measure the contents. It's automated now, so it's probably continuously measuring. It's sucking aliquots or quantities of air from the atmosphere and measuring the quantity of CO2 in that unit of air. But as we see here, remember, this line is not going flat. It goes up and down every year. And that's those small things, right? Respiration from soil and from plants are emitting CO2 back to the atmosphere. CO2 is captured by plants that are using that interaction between microbes and roots and soil to fire forward productivity, to make photosynthesis happen. And that draws down the CO2. So tiny things at small scales can have very large impacts on global biogeochemistry. Now also, those same things are what's driving forward soil development, soil weathering, and a lot of other things. Scale matters, both temporal and spatial. Okay, last couple ones, last one. So the last question, or one of the first questions, was, why do soil horizons have letters and what do they mean, right? And we're going to get to that as we move forward. And I know this first module was a lot, and I was throwing big ideas at you, but that was just to frame up the stuff that we're going to end up with, right? We're going to go back and work out the details. And I know that's uncomfortable sometimes. You think we should walk through this very linear matter, but I want to give you the magnitude and the grandness of it all, so then we can go back and work through the individual ideas. So why do soils have letters? What do they mean? I'm just going to say it's simply just a classification system. No different than letter grades, stoplight, green mean go and red mean stop, or any other thing. We use A, B, C, R, and otherwise, and some subscripts. That's just the way they decided to do it. And there's probably some legacy if you want to dive into it and understand the thought process of the folks that came up with this taxonomic system. But really, it's just a way to communicate about soil properties, certain features that are found in certain places, based on our knowledge of inputs, outputs, in additions, losses, translocations, transformations. Knowing that certain soils have certain properties predominantly in the surface, other properties in subsoils, and so on. And being able to start to relate the soil on the left here that has an A, B, W, and a series of C's versus this one on the right that has an O, an A, an ABT, a BT, a BT, a CR, and an R. The one on the left is very young. It's got a little bit of development in the surface. The one on the right is got nicely developed soil horizons with accumulation of clay in the subsoil. Those things happen over time because of all the features we just talked about. And that A, B, and C and subscripts just allows us to communicate. Once you know that a BT means it has accumulation of clay, you can start to imagine that that soil's been there for a while. Soil forming processes have been happening. Versus the one on the left that has an A, a BW, which means weak, and then a series of C horizons, which just means undifferentiated parent material. Okay? So, last one. Lots in front of us. We just seen a lot in this class already. We've talked about big ideas. The first module, as I said, was a broad overview, and I wanted to expose you, right? And from your notes and from the statements that you made in there, many of you are like, yeah, soils are rad, I didn't know. And that was the whole point. I wanted to get you excited and interested and engaged. And then the rest of the semester, we're going to be walking through a lot of these basic ideas that lead us and support us in these bigger ideas that we've already talked about. And hopefully you'll find a place for them in there. Wow, I didn't realize this was this. And hopefully it'll fit in one of these bigger important ideas. The rest of the semester is just going to be about us making sense of it all. And hopefully you're going to remember a decent amount of it over time. All right? So hopefully this was useful. Ask me questions if you're in my section, or ask Becky questions if you're in her section. And just keep doing your work and all will be well. Take care.